Hi, welcome. It's Saturday, March 10th. It's good to be here. And as I'm doing this blog piece today, Saturday is going to be another day to work upstairs in my bathroom in the shower. I don't know if I've shared with you, but I've spent the last 2 weeks tearing it all out down to the studs and redoing it and putting new tile in. I'm getting awfully tired of this project. It'd be great if I had like 5 days where I could just work on it, but it's hard to fit in little bits and pieces in the midst of work and life and everything else. But it's getting old, but it is getting near the end, and I hope to finish soon. But kind of leads me into a little bit about today's reading, because we're looking at Genesis 30 or at Numbers 32 and 33 today, and we're kind of coming to the end, and we're getting to this point where they're getting ready to go across the Jordan into the promised land, the land of Canaan. And then we have this curious story, and it's going to harken back to something Jacob said in Genesis 49 here in a moment. But as we read this account, we have this Reuben and Gad coming across this land on the east side of the Jordan that they think would work really well for cattle farming, and they decide that maybe they would just land here, and would this be okay? So they go to ask Moses, and Moses is very angry with them because he's hearkening back to the other times where there's failure of the people to follow through. Things get hard or difficult, and the people kind of tire and say, "I've had enough of this." And in this case, he's sensing that same thing in Reuben. And I think most commentators feel the same way, because ultimately, as Moses gets angry, then Reuben and Gad come back and they change their tune. Well, actually, we're just going to build places for our families, and then we'll come with you and do that. And so probably their first request more signified where they were coming from, and that is, we understand God wanted us to go forward across into the promised land as one people, unified, but boy, this sure looks profitable over here for us, and we think maybe we'd like to just settle down at this point. And that is not what God intended or desires in his people, and they then come up with an alternative. And what's interesting is that Moses does at this point compromise, as we see, and says, okay, you can have it, but you better follow through on what you've agreed to. And I think there's a couple of interesting things here that come to mind. And actually there are three things today that I would point out to you. And one of them is that compromise always has its costs. And this is a case where that becomes true. This whole narrative kind of reminds me of many times we talk about Christians and the Christian life and wanting to live in the shallows rather than swimming out in the deep. We get comfortable with our lives and as followers of Christ, but we don't want to really go all the way. And we'd rather just stay where we're at. And it also reminded me of the rich young ruler as he came to Jesus, and here he is, so to speak, standing at the gates of the promised land, and Jesus said, well, here what you need to do is sell everything you have and give half to the poor. That's what you need to do. And his attachment to the world at that moment prevented him to doing that. He decided, that's too hard a thing. I'll just settle for this, and that's what he was looking for. And what's interesting is that if you remember back in Genesis 49, Jacob on his dying bed says about Reuben that he's unstable as water. And here it kind of seems to come true. It kind of is substantiated in this fact that Reuben is kind of double-minded, if we quote James 1:8. And maybe James was kind of referring back to Jacob's comments. But Reuben is kind of like, I'm a Christian, but I'm also in the world, and I kind of got a two-minded streak, which kind of war against each other a little bit, and that's not healthy. And I'm reminded of many times how I am like that also. So number one, we need to worry about compromise all the time when it comes to the call on our lives and the desire that God has for our lives. Moses finally tells Reuben, and I think verse 23 of chapter 23 is really insightful. Moses says to him, be careful, your sin will find you out. And I think we need to take that to heart, that not only will our sin find us out, our sin will search us out. Our sin will hunt us down many times. And so that becomes the way we think and operate, and we need to be careful about that. So compromise has its cost. The other things I would bring up in chapter 33, where it kind of goes through that whole trek of the wilderness route, scholars can't agree on the exact route or the timing of all the places they camped, but what is true is that the wanderings basically did not take 40 years to get from one place to the next. The journey was long because the people sinned, and in their sin they ended up running around in circles and not getting anywhere. And I think that's a big lesson for us to learn as well. We need to pay attention to that when we let the world influence us and when we let sin fester in us, our spiritual life kind of ends up in a quagmire, and we aren't moving forward. We're just kind of spinning our wheels and going in circles. And then the third thing I would share with you today is that God gives them instructions on what to do to the Canaanites. And we know he says, destroy them all, wipe them out. They are an utterly depraved people, and they needed to be wiped out so as not to contaminate the Israelites, God's people. And it's going to be a war. And it's a war that's not unlike the war you and I face each and every day, where we are called to drown that old Adam. And not allow sin to control us, but subdue it. Because when sin gets in our lives and we don't work at kicking it out and calling upon God to help us by discipline and by study and by calling others in to help us be accountable and by working every day to work on our faith, then it gets a foothold. And then we find ourselves running around in circles, much like the Israelites did. We find ourselves living out in the wilderness, not growing spiritually, and not carrying out the call that God has on our lives. So the third thing I would share today, besides compromise always has costs, and also when we let sin fester, is that we end up kind of wandering in circles. The third thing is every day needs to be a battle within ourselves to subdue that sinful nature. And again, I'm not talking about receiving forgiveness and life eternal. That is a gracious gift from God to us in Jesus Christ. Much as the freedom from bondage in Egypt was a gift of God to the people of that day as they left Egypt for their new life. But the war then was to follow God each and every day after that. The war was to be faithful to God. And that's the work that the Spirit does in us each day as he recreates us and reshapes us. And we need to accept his lordship over our lives, do the things and make ourselves available so that he might be able to do that work. And then every day struggle and battle and fight against that old Adam so that that sin in our lives does not gain a foothold and make us double-minded, or make us decide, you know what, this is too hard, I'll just settle for where I'm at. It's kind of like ultimately coming full circle here today. My project in a little while of finishing up my bathroom, I'm getting real tired of it, and I'm not going to give up. But it would be real easy to say, you know what, I've had enough of this. Why don't I just hire someone to finish this and stop at this point? I think that in our spiritual life is also true. Let's hang in there. God calls us to be faithful, and he gives us what we need. We just need to go about that task. We need to make that the important work of our lives every day, not just take our faith for granted, and not just allow the world to get too much of a foothold on our lives, like the rich young ruler. So several thoughts for today. I hope they're helpful, and love to hear from you as to how that battle in your life with that old sinful nature is going, and are you on track, and are you moving forward with God's call on your life? Have a great day. God's blessings to you.